Welcome to the 62nd episode of the New Ventures podcast. I'm your host, Sanjoy Sanyal, the founder of Regan Paradise, a boutique climate finance firm and a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School. I host this podcast series to help explore the links between climate change and food security. Our guest for today is Tom Skiddo, the CEO of TreeAid, a charity working with communities in the drylands of Africa to tackle poverty and the effects of climate crisis. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks very much, Sanjoy. It's an absolute pleasure to be here talking to you today.
Tom, we'll start by trying to know you a little bit. You have had a long career in the nonprofit sector. Tell us a little bit about how you came to TreeAid and where in your career did this understanding between climate change and development, when did that dawn on you?
Yeah, I've been working in the aid and international development sector now for nearly 20 years. And I actually started out much more in the humanitarian sphere. So throughout my career, I was involved in responding to the famine in East Africa, some significant floods in Pakistan in 2010 and 11. I was actually on the ground within the first week of Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. And finally, I was living in the South Pacific in a country called Vanuatu. And me and my family tried to sleep as there was a Category 5 cyclone happening outside. And I was up the next day and didn't stop working for about 6 months straight responding to that. And what I found in all of that humanitarian aid was the incredible feeling of futility to be running around, delivering aid, delivering tarpaulins, food, water, soap, sometimes cash funding to these people who were in desperate need. And of course, it was vitally important at that time. But all of these things that were happening around me were happening as a result of a worsening climate. These once-in-a-lifetime disasters that were happening every year for me. And I was being more and more in the middle of them. And for me, it felt like there had to be something more. There had to be some solution out there that was trying to support people and help people help themselves, but dealing with the causes of the climate crisis rather than the outcomes from it. And that's when I turned to TreeAid, and I turned to an organization that has been founded since 1987, but with a real focus on that cause of the climate crisis, cause of the issues that are affecting people across Africa, and actually was founded out of that basis, out of looking at the response to the humanitarian needs in places like Sudan and Ethiopia in the 1980s, and trying to offer an alternative, a very forward-thinking alternative to say, what can we do to prevent this from happening in the first place?
When were you in East Africa, and which countries were you in?
So I was working in the UK, but supporting the responses in Ethiopia, in Kenya, and in Somalia. And I was out in Kenya in the Turkana region, and particularly Turkana in the north of the country was significantly affected by land degradation, by desertification, by famine and drought. And people really, in that space suffered significantly and continually. And the responses that we were able to provide were short-term. And that was often a result of the kind of funding modalities that what drives the international aid community to support these significant issues.
Just curious, which years were they?
I was there in 2007, 2006, and I was there also in 2012.
Right. You started already talking about TreeAid. You've told us about the genesis of the organization, which is providing a long-term solution to the problem rather than reacting to the great humanitarian crisis. But maybe a little bit more about your organization, which countries do you operate in, and a little bit more about your philosophy.
Yeah, TreeAid was really looking at the symbiosis that needs to exist between humans and the nature that they live within. So really looking at how do we restore landscapes and support people to do that in a way that's actually helps lift them out of poverty, helps them actually embrace and harness their environments around them to have kind of a thriving environment, but thriving communities and thriving lives in that space. Really, it's exclusively focused in some of the worst hit parts of the world for land degradation, for human development challenges. So we work across largely Sahelian countries, dryland contexts in Senegal, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, northern Ghana, and Ethiopia as well. And really looking to work hand in hand with communities, local organizations, but with a lot of our own team on the ground, trying to support communities to relook at their landscape, to re-understand and reimagine how their landscape could be restored and how they could actually gain benefits from that, and co-creating those solutions and leaving communities in a position of significant improvements to their outcome, like their health outcomes, their incomes, but also to have a much more biodiverse and developed environment around them.
Well, actually, you jumped right into the problem when you said land degradation and desertification are problems that are affecting many countries in Africa. Land degradation, for our audience, is the loss of the productive capacity of the land. And land desertification, when Tom talks about land desertification, he means arid and semi-arid lands in arid and semi-arid places being turned into deserts. Why does this happen?
Land degradation is happening in many places around the world. It's happening in Europe, Asia, South America, Africa, North America. In the context of the Sahel, there are many reasons that are very pertinent to that zone. If you think about the weather patterns of the Sahel, you have a situation where there is usually 3 significant months of rain, if you're fortunate at least. Otherwise, it's a very dry, arid environment where there is no rain. And when that rain does come, it comes in a significant amount, which creates a significant level of water flow, which can erode soil, pull topsoil off, and lose the fertility of that land. Exacerbating that is the fact that as people seek to create farmland, land has been cleared, trees have been cut down. As people have sought to mechanize the way they farm, trees have been removed from farm spaces. And those trees were providing a vital role to that ecosystem. They were keeping the soil moist. They were reducing the chances of fast flow of water over that and reducing the chances of erosion of topsoil. And they were also fertilizing that land as well. So that kind of constant barrage every year of extreme context of weather, extreme heat and then extreme rain, has caused untold damage to more and more land. And as more and more land is required, because that previous land has become degraded, more land has been cleared. And again, through a negative cycle, we're in a situation where that land is equally degraded. And it's a constant negative cycle of degradation, desertification, lack of fertility to soil, and it's driving more and more people into extreme levels of poverty and hunger.
One of the very key points that you're making is that forest land is being converted into agricultural land, and that itself is leading to land degradation. Many people who work in climate get this, but to some people, this is a contradiction that, you are basically you're putting more land to grow food. The very process of doing that is causing food insecurity. Would you want to elaborate on this a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's what I was trying to explain with the negative cycle, essentially. So you are forced in any position where the land that you've been allocated is not providing enough food across the 1-2 hectares for a family that is required to feed that family. So the clear only option in that space is to find fertile land. Now, that fertile land may currently be an existing forest space, in which case that forest would need to be cleared to do some level of farming. Now, the clearance of that forest creates its own level of land degradation And it doesn't take long for what was once fertile land to become infertile as rains create that level of erosion, pull off that topsoil, create those gullies, and you become in a situation where, again, you need to find new land, which may have some fertility. Now, we're talking about a context where people don't have spare income in order to invest in fertilizers and things like this. So it is relying entirely on an organic system of farming, which is very good if it works, but if it's not done in a way that actually maintains that topsoil and keeps that fertility, then the people are forced into desperate choices.
In this situation that you've described, where people don't have money to invest in fertilizers or in irrigation and dependent on an organic system of cultivation, and arable land is being converted into fertile land, is rapidly disappearing. How do people survive?
I mean, it's a significant challenge in the Sahel to survive. People work incredible hours, incredible times in the sun to try and just feed their family. But this is a place that people have been living and thriving for millennia. I mean, if you only have to go back 800 years in history to the Mali kingdom and imagine that the Sahel was the center of the world. It was one of the richest places in the world. And so it's certainly a modern phenomenon driven by a few things, driven by deforestation, which is pushing farmers into negative cycles where they're having to respond to the degraded land and the effects that erosion are having. But on top of that, it's also driven by the increasing climatic conditions that are happening around the world, but particularly happening in the Sahel. I mean, the Sahel is already 1 degree hotter than it was in 1970. It's predicted to be 3 or 4 degrees hotter than now by the end of this century, which is twice the international estimated average. But people are very passionate about this place. I mean, this is a beautiful place with beautiful people who want to thrive in their homeland. And it's possible. It's possible if you can readjust the way that those landscapes are managed. You can work with communities, you can restore those landscapes and actually create viable jobs and livelihoods for people across that space. And that's what we're trying to do.
I hope my listeners have got a sense of the magnitude of the problem that we are talking about. People have been thriving for centuries, but at this point of time, this is the frontier of climate change. This is where the global greenhouse gases has already led to temperature rises of about 1 degree centigrade, which means that rainfall patterns have got disrupted, which means that people have responded by deforestation, which itself has meant land degradation, and which in turn has led to the problem of food security. I think what I'm taking away, Tom, is that your experience of responding to crises just made you understand how futile that is. And you made you understand that you have to go back and look at the causes, why these disasters happen. Both the disasters in terms of sudden climate events, like what we call in climate science is extreme climate events, it is, cyclones and typhoons. But incredibly important is these, what we call chronic events or slow setting events, which is and prolonged drought conditions. With that, we'll jump right into what we wanted to talk about, which is your project. And I'm going to ask you to describe to us a typical project.
Sure. The ideal approach for tree aid is a holistic program of work. It's not about coming into a country and planting some trees and walking away and assuming that everything will be fine. We've spent 35 years developing a very clear understanding of what works and what doesn't work. And so our approach is quite multifaceted. So in the first stage, let's say, in any context where we're with a community, we look at the land use and we look at the land rights and we look at the tenure systems and we look at what people's responsibilities and roles are. And we talk to those communities to understand how could we collectivize the management, particularly of common land. There's a lot of commons in the space, a lot of grazing areas, collective forest areas. And how are those commons managed in a way where communities feel a vested interest? They feel that they have a benefit from that common land, but a responsibility. And how do they take that responsibility forward to really understand what the long-term vision for that landscape is? And that forest governance, that understanding how to govern your communal area, is a bedrock to any of this. And it doesn't necessarily get the attention it needs because actually it's such a basic piece of work that is essential to do any kind of restoration afterwards. Understanding the rules of the game, having every community member understand the rules of the game, understand what their roles are and what their benefits are is essential. Once we've got that in place, then we have to work out what would it take for a community to be incentivized enough to protect and restore its landscape against, these negative cycles of being forced into a deforestation activity in order to farm. So looking at the benefits that come from those communal forests in particular, and looking from the benefits that come from trees on farms in agroforestry systems, and working out what the long-term benefits are, which I've already tried to explain, are around that soil fertility, those yields, the shades that you get from those trees. But in the short term, there are significant benefits that can be had from maintaining and protecting the resources you have, and then to build on those. And that's particularly around what we call non-timber forest products. So whether that's nuts or seeds or leaves, some products that your listeners may have heard of, like shea butter, are very prevalent in this region. And if you can support communities to collectivize their endeavors, to develop businesses and livelihoods around things like shea butter, these non-timber forest products, you can actually significantly diversify their income. You can create a situation where almost 50% of their daily income or the annual income is coming from non-timber forest product enterprises. In that case, the value of the forest is so much more than just a place that could be deforested to farm on. It becomes a central, integral part of your diversified income stream. And now we've talked about how do people survive in the Sahel. Well, diversification of income is really important for that resilience. And so if there is a failure of crop, you still have other safety nets, other incomes that are coming in. Once that becomes self-evident in any community, once those livelihoods are developed, once people can see the value that these forests and these trees provide in the short term as well as the long term, then we can work with a community to say, so how are we going to protect and how are we going to restore? So working really closely with communities to work on that governance, understand what they want in terms of the landscape. Where do they want to reforest? Where do they want to graze? How do they want to manage this space? And then helping them build those skills in terms of tree management, nursery management, tree health care provision, understanding how to prune a tree that requires pruning, understand how to grow a tree and when to plant it and how to care for it, but also understanding how to manage the soil and the water and conserving that as well around it so that actually things thrive in that landscape. And those skills and those inputs are provided to really see a significant step change in the way that overall landscape begins to look and feel, and the benefits start to flow through more and more for the community. Finally, income is an important part of a resilient life and a healthy life for those communities, but bringing in the food that is prevalent from trees in those environments into the diets of those communities is another important part in driving better health outcomes, better life outcomes, but also incentives to maintain and protect that environment. So bringing in tree foods and diversifying people's diets is really important in this context. If you think about a place where it only rains and there's only one harvest one time a year, then if you can bring in tree foods, which provide nutritious food outside of those cyclical rain harvest times, and actually you can have access to leaves and fruits at times where otherwise there's only dried cereal crops available, then we've seen significant nutritional outcomes for both adults, but particularly for under fives. And so all of those component parts add together, they work as a kind of holistic team to really transform the outcomes for people living in those communities.
There is a triple approach there. One is working with the community, the other is increasing incomes, and the other is enabling food security. Tell us a little bit about increasing incomes, enabling the farmers to access markets. You talked about shea butter, so that's often an urban market, right? How do you sort of do that?
Yeah, well, it starts first. The way Tree Aid works in empowering these communities is to come into any community and organize them in such a way that actually a collective endeavor, where you have an enterprise of maybe 25, 30 people, often women, which is a really important point that I'd like to make, is that the traditions in these areas is that non-timber forest products are the purview of women in the community and are at this point in many places underdeveloped as markets. So we're often working with women to help develop these cooperatives, these collective efforts. We're working on building their business skills, working on helping them understand how to produce the product in the most high quality way, to package that product, to market that product, and to find avenues to sell on. There can be challenges geographically, contextually, but the demand is there. And if we can drive more demand to access these products, then we're able to find fair and appropriate prices for that community to benefit significantly. And we work in many different parts of the value chain. So, for example, recently we've been developing more domestic demand in Burkina Faso. So we've been working at the city level. So it's not just about international trade, but actually working at the city level of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, for example, to encourage supermarkets within the city to actually market and sell non-timber forest products that are produced in their own country by the kind of communities that we're working with. And I think stimulating that demand, building that knowledge and awareness of what's available in country is just as important as looking at international markets.
It is absolutely important to create that domestic demand. When rainfall occurs in just a short period of time, and that too probably a few days of heavy downpour and then long spells of dry weather between those heavy downpours, how do you ensure that trees are irrigated?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things there, I suppose. In the long term, as I've said, the best way to ensure that water is retained within the soil is having more trees. And obviously that's the end goal. So there's some things that we need to do in advance of that. First off, the kind of trees that we're working with are indigenous trees within these communities that people are familiar with. And a lot of these trees are quite drought resistant. So as long as they are planted out at the beginning of a rainy season, as the first rains come, then there should be sufficient rain to establish that tree quite successfully in those first 3 months. And that tree is then robust and resilient enough to see through the next dry season until the next rainy season. There are other things, though, that are going to help keep enough water within that farmland, within that forest area, which are really important component parts. And a lot of that's what we do in terms of soil and water conservation. So what we at Tree Aid always try to do is make sure that these are low-tech solutions. These are solutions that can be adopted by any farmer, can be delivered en masse with limited technology to do that. And so at each farm level and each community level, we're working with communities to reintroduce in many ways traditional practices. So there are things called zai pits and there are things called demi-lunes. To explain it, I mean, in the basic sense, these are kind of very small water reservoirs. So if you're digging into this extremely hard soil and creating a space that water can run into, then there can be a lot more water retained within a smaller space. and that can help things grow in that context. We also do other work around stone bunds. So how do we actually slow down water flow as it's running across farmland? How do we actually slow that down and maintain it across flatter areas? And at a larger scale, we might do something at the community level, which may take a bit more heavy lifting, but it would be what we locally call in Burkina Faso anyway, a bouli, but that's a very large water reservoir. So if you think in capacity terms, we're talking about the size of an Olympic swimming pool in terms of the amount of water that could be in there. And they will fill up over a rainy season, either through rain directly in or rain channeling in from the surrounding farmland. And more often than not, that water stays there pretty much until the next rainy season or pretty close to. So there's access for plants in that surrounding area to access the water table, and people can irrigate their farmland. They can also irrigate the trees in the forests. Even animals can use it as a watering hole. So there's many different ways that we have to approach the context of this area and use that valuable resource of rainwater in the most effective way.
And before we move on, would you like to just give one example maybe of a project, just to bring to life, if you may, the impacts?
Yes, so there's one particular project, I suppose, in mind, project that we completed. So we've got some really nice data to show the beginning and the end of how that project ran, is something I made allusions to earlier around developing the domestic market for non-timber forest products. So in Burkina Faso, we were funded for 4 years to build the capacity of communities to really develop their businesses in non-timber forest products. So really working with communities hand in hand to add non-timber forest products as a vital part of their income stream. At the same time, working with them at a local level to develop nutritional gardens, so to work on their ability to access the foods that are available from trees. And finally, working on the domestic market to stimulate that and to create more interest in the purchase of those products. And what we found is that you can literally double or sometimes triple someone's daily income from this kind of work. And I think it's something that really can be life-changing for these people if we get it right, if we support people to make sure that it's beneficial to everyone within the family, and to particularly women have the rights and the choices that they need to have. In terms of the nutritional outcomes, we found that from this program, there was 42% decrease in chronic malnutrition in under fives just through accessing a simple thing like leaves of the moringa plant or the baobab plant in drier seasons. That ability to access something that isn't just dried cereals is just so vital to change the outcomes of those children's physical and mental development.
Do you want to just refer a little bit to the gender impact as well?
A lot of the work that we do is very much focused on the non-timber forest product that are accessed in the forests, and that is the purview of women. And what we've found is that building their capacity to manage their own businesses, manage their own income, actually has a much bigger knock-on effect than simply improving the family's income, in the sense that it provides women with much more choices and decision-making power within the family, and empowers them to take more leadership roles within the community as well. So this for us is a kind of central part of what we're trying to do in these human development conceptions, is how do we kind of deal with sort of some of the challenges of a traditional farming model where men are dominant and men make most of the decisions. And trees have a surprisingly powerful role in the ability for women to have a much stronger role in society and in community, and essentially level up the unfair inequalities that exist in many parts of the world.
Many things that you've said in your process prevent things from growing wrong. In the climate terminology, there's a word called maladaptation, which is basically the benefits of these projects not coming through in the way you expect them to come through. Focus on gender in the process is important. Looking at the community rights, which you talked about right in the beginning, and working with the community is very important. I want to pick up and ask you, how important is it to work with local partners?
Oh, it's absolutely essential. I think for the long term, we've got very proud long-term relationships with many local partners. And I think there's a thriving civil society in the Sahel. Of course, there are capacity challenges. Of course, there are areas that we need to work with them to develop, but they really hold a unique position because they are the trusted community civil society organizations that the people that we're representing trust most, work with day to day, and they have the best knowledge. They're on the ground. They see what's happening day to day. So for us, it's really important that when TreeAid's delivering its work, it's doing it in combination and partnership with many different people. I mean, our partnership is first and foremost with those people we serve in the communities, but very much it's done in partnership with local civil society as well as local government as well. You know, local government plays a very important role in understanding how to manage these landscapes. And so all of these component parts are central. And as you say, that if you don't get these partnerships right, then there's more likely that your project will fail in the long term. And I think 35 years of doing this, we've found that this holistic model that we've talked about is how to get things done effectively. And it's not to just rush in with a quick idea and a hope that you can solve these problems instantly.
And that's absolutely right, Tom. You can't solve them overnight. And rushing in with a quick idea is probably just going to make matters really worse. The point, however, is that what will it take for this thriving community of civil society to be able to raise capital on their own and implement projects on their own?
We're already in a position now where the best and the strongest of those civil society organizations we wholly trust, and they deliver on the ground for us with minimal support from our side. There's others that need more support, and it's a continuum, essentially. Each one of these organizations has its mission, it has its dreams, has its hopes to support the communities it's in, and it's a continuum of building that capacity so they can do it. I think there is a challenge out there, which is that international funding gets stuck. It doesn't flow down to those communities as much as it should. I mean, certainly TreeAid is doing its part, but there's a lot of funding that gets stuck at bureaucratic levels. Bureaucracy is not always the best for land restoration, let's say. And so I think it's certainly a mission of TreeAid's that we advocate for local civil society to be the ones receiving funding, to be the ones receiving capacity building, to be the ones delivering across this whole region. I mean, we need a mosaic of actors. We need a mosaic of projects to build the restoration that's required across this space. It cannot be centralized. It has to be decentralized.
Of course, there is an element of capacity, but is it the capacity to raise capital from international markets and international donors, or is it the capacity to implement projects?
I think it's both. I think sometimes organizations might need support, for example, on monitoring and evaluation. So an organization might need that capacity building in how do I really know that this is having the effect on the community I want it to have? Sometimes it can be on simple things around your ability to do your accounting or your ability to do a good training. And so a lot of work for us is around identifying those capacity gaps in a local partner and building their capacity where it's possible to do so. Of course, there's a capacity issue in terms of accessing funding. I think the international aid world is a complex one. And I think, there was been various accords, Paris and Accra, which have tried to demystify the aid business, but there continues to be a very, very large gap between what a major international donor expects and what a local implementing partner can deliver, both in terms of what they expect in reporting and in data and in information flow, but also what they expect in scale. I mean, most of these international aid organizations, the funding development, are looking to work in the millions, but at least the hundred thousands of dollars. So a local organization might need $50,000 to make a significant impact over a landscape that it's responsible for, or that it's working with a community who's responsible for. But it's very difficult to access that kind of funding. And so one thing TreeAid's trying to do is essentially play that middle role of accessing the funding, but then channeling that down to those who can deliver on the ground more effectively.
Absolutely right. Let's go back to that project that you talked about in Burkina Faso. Now that the project is over, what about its sustainability?
Well, this is, why I work at TreeAid. I work at TreeAid because I know from all of the programs that we've finished off on, the sustainability is baked in from the start. We understand that communities need a hand up. They don't need a hand out. And if they're in a position where they are more empowered, they are in a position where they can have better incomes, have better landscapes, and have those rights established, then they have no reason not to continue to thrive and to do better than when we were there, essentially. I mean, this is what's really important about the work we do. We're getting the ball rolling. We're not continuing to roll it, essentially. So these things continue to move and improve without us there.
Obviously, this is great. In some contexts, I've been hearing conversations that carbon credits and digital solutions will enable sustainability of these projects. Have you been experimenting with this at all?
Yeah, and I think it is an interesting one. I think there's a lot of negative criticism out there, some of it rightful, around the carbon market. I think the carbon market has a lot of issues which need to be resolved. But in terms of reducing, but also removing carbon from the atmosphere using nature-based solutions, I think there's something really exciting there, in the sense that actually, if we can cut out a lot of the middle people in this space, if we can get companies who want to buy carbon credits, funding communities to restore their landscapes, that seems to me like a win-win opportunity. We're already exploring this ourselves. We've established a project this year for 3 million tons of carbon, where the communities in Burkina Faso will be working to restore their land. They'll be growing about 10 million trees over the next 8 years, but they'll be receiving the payments from that. They'll be receiving carbon credit payments during the implementation phase, but for the next 30 years. And that allows an additional income stream. We talk about that diversifying income streams. Okay, you've got your farmland, you've got your non-timber forest products. What if now we add carbon as another component? Then that really does put them in a position of strength, and the potential for their development is made greater. I think the challenge is that in a new market, there are a lot of different versions of how these things should be done. And certainly from TreeAid's perspective, we're advocating that the community is front and center in this, that the trees that we grow are first and foremost for them, and that carbon rights are their carbon rights. And if somebody wants to incentivize them to restore an environment, then they should pay appropriately to do that in a fair trade way. But the potential there for private investment, I think, is huge. And I think it's necessary, because at the minute, the money that's required to go into the Sahel to actually drive the restoration that's required just isn't there. You asked about digital. I think the world's use of satellite technology is just running at a pace that is hard to keep up with. But I think that there's some very exciting tools out there in terms of not only having photographic satellite data, but also LiDAR data to really understand what the changes in biomass are in those spaces. And that opens up the potential for a lot more transparency in this space, which I think is better for everyone if we can have a very transparent, evidence-based discussion around what's possible in these landscapes and what is happening, and why that community should be paid fairly for what they've achieved.
So we've come to the end of our podcast. I'm going to ask you, you were there in the New York Climate Week last month, and maybe you'll be in COP. What is your message for other organizations and other countries, actually?
I think my message is there is not enough actors and there is not enough funding in this really vital part of the world. And I invite everyone to come, whether you're an investor, you're an organization delivering programs in this kind in other parts of the world. I invite you to come and look at the Sahel and realize that this is an important part of the world. This is a place that is incredibly vulnerable, with people who are keen to be part of the solution. And please come and join, and we can actually achieve the aims that we want to achieve across this whole landscape.
I'm going to reflect a little bit on what you have said so far. It's been basically an extremely rich discussion, but I think a few things that I'll take away. One is working with the community, working with local partners, focusing both on products that have export markets, but also domestic markets. We sometimes forget how well stocked African urban supermarkets are, and sometimes with imported food products. If these products can be replaced by products produced from the local communities or maybe from other African nations, this has an incredible impact on the overall African economy. The point that you made, Tom, about the thriving ecosystem of non-profit players in the Sahel is true for across Africa. And it is very important that we strengthen their hands. There is very little funding often going to these local organizations because of the complicated structures that you have alluded to. And this is not just in the nonprofit sector, by the way. I worked with the World Resources Institute for a decade, and one of my papers was how little funding is going to the local entrepreneurs building clean energy access pay-as-you-go products versus the millions that are going for Western companies. There is a space for everybody. The Western organizations bring the capacity. They raise the dialogue at an international level. But often the work is being done by local organizations, and it's absolutely important to strengthen their hands. If properly implemented, carbon and digital solutions can do that. And though the carbon market has been criticized, you're right, Tom, but if implemented with local partners, if implemented with satellite technology, then we can bring in incredible transparency to this entire marketplace. And if people want to get in touch with you, how should they?
Oh, I think people should definitely go to our website, www.treeaid.org, and hopefully read a lot more about what we're doing, and get in touch through the website, and we'll happily engage.
With that, thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you, Sanjoy. That was great.
If you like this podcast, do visit us on regainparadise.org, regainparadise.com. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, and you can also subscribe to these podcasts on Anchor, Spotify, Google, Apple, and YouTube.